Hi, everybody. It's such a privilege today for me to be talking with one of my academic heroes, actually, Alex Edmans. Alex is the professor of finance and academic director for the London Business School. He graduated from Oxford University and then worked for Morgan Stanley in investment banking in London. And he was on the fixed income sales and trading side in New York as well. And I think that's important because one of the things that I love about Alex's work is it is so very, very grounded in reality. And I think that's why it really, for my work, it carries so much weight and why I appreciate it. So I think it goes back. My theory is it goes back to his experience working in Morgan Stanley. And then he went after a PhD in finance from MIT's Sloan School as a Fulbright scholar. He joined Wharton in 2007 and was tenured in 2013, shortly before moving back to London Business School. And his research has been covered in the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, New York Times, The Economist, and The Times. And he's been interviewed on Bloomberg, BBC, CNBC. I think you get the picture. Alex is truly an expert on all things related to ESG, on employee engagement and well-being and how it affects the bottom line of organizations. And it's something that I have appreciated for such a long time. He's spoken at the World Economic Forum in Davos. He's testified to the UK Parliament. Again, the world looks to him to really guide us in terms of how we take business to the next level in a socially responsible and profitable way. And that's what's so exciting about his work. So today he is here because he has the paperback coming out of your book, right? Alex is coming out.
Absolutely.
When is that?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So every author loves this, is when somebody holds up their book and it's like ripped and it's all outlined. I mean, this is just a book that I bought immediately when it came out in hard copy. And I am so glad that I did because it really takes all of his work even to the next level. So Alex, it's great to have you here.
Fantastic to be here also, Cali. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Oh, you're so very welcome. And I am going to share in a few minutes specifically how his work has influenced my work in terms of executing flexibility in organizations. But let's pull back the lens first. And I want to talk to you, Alex, about your concept of pie economics, which is you call pie growing versus the more traditional shareholder profit-driven economic model. So I just want to quote something that you wrote in your book, Grow the Pie, about pie economics. You wrote, how great companies deliver, this is your book is called Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit. And you write, as pie-growing enterprises focus on creating social value with the assurance that most value-creating actions will, sometimes unexpectedly, increase long-run profits, but also with the recognition that a few won't. So even if the profit effects of every action were perfectly predictable, which, as discussed, is almost never the case, pie economics might prefer an action that grows the pie, even if it doesn't maximize profits. So that statement, even if it doesn't maximize profits, that sounds like a major departure from the supposedly, and I'm using that word very specifically, supposedly shareholder-focused, profit-driven model. And that's the model that's driven a lot of the decision-making in organizations. So I want to start by asking you, how is pie economics different from that supposed shareholder-focused, profit-driven model that so many organizations have followed for decades?
So I'd say it is indeed different from the profit-driven model, but actually surprisingly, I'd say it's not too different from the shareholder-focused model. So why is that? Because I often think, well, if you're shareholder-focused, you're profit-driven. But what do shareholders care about? So you and I, I'm sure, are shareholders in many companies, and we care about our retirement. That's why we're investing. But what do we care about in our retirement? It's not just our income in retirement, but our living standards. So we don't want to live in a planet which is 2 degrees warmer or is paying scant attention to things like diversity and inclusion. So I would be happy for many of the companies that I invest in to make small financial sacrifices if this indeed addresses some social goals. So the whole core heart of my work is the idea of the pie grow mentality, that many things that you do to benefit society also benefit profit. So there are lots of win-wins. But even when there are not win-wins, when there are some trade-offs, it can still be that you are acting in shareholders' interests, even if you don't take the action that's going to make the most amount of money. It might be you're making 90 or 95% of the available profit opportunity, but your shareholders are willing for you to sacrifice that 5 or 10, maybe some cases 20%, if the social goal that you are addressing is such an important one.
Interesting. Okay, so then here's my question. Why don't the players in this economic ecosystem, and when I'm talking about analysts, the market, shareholders, decision makers in organizations, even board members, why don't they seem to understand that that model actually is the better model? And there does seem to be, in some cases, this very short-term myopic focus on only the things that return a profit, not allowing for some of these other things that ultimately would return a higher profit, but it's longer term. Why doesn't the economic system, why isn't it set up to understand that and then action on it?
Yeah, that's a really important question, Cali. And I say there's two main reasons. So first is the prevalence of the fixed pie mentality. So what do I mean by this? What is the pie to begin with? The pie is the value that a company creates through its products and services. And often people think that that pie is fixed. So you can either give that pie to investors in the form of profits, or you can give it to society. That might be workers in the form of high wages, customers in the form of fair prices, maybe the government in the form of higher taxes. And often a business leader thinks that if my goal is to maximize profits, and if the pie is fixed, I need to squeeze every last drop from everybody else. I can only increase my slice if I reduce other people's. And so how might I do that? I might pay as low wages as possible or work my employees as hard as possible. And if you think about it, some of the greatest, most successful management innovations have been ways, unfortunately, to squeeze stuff out of your workers. So Ford, when he launched the assembly line, why was that a genius innovation in some respects? Because it forced workers to keep up with the pace of production, ensure that they did not shirk. So why is my book called Grow the Pie? What I'm trying to stress, not just based on wishful thinking, but a lot of rigorous evidence, is that the pie is not fixed. So when you are treating your employees well, paying them more than they need to, maybe giving them more flexi time and parental leave, you're not charitably just giving part of a pie to them. You're making them more motivated, more productive, and they pay you this back by being more productive and more willing to stay and the like. So this is why I really like your introduction, Cali. So when I do my work, I do highlight the ethical and moral reasons for being responsible, but you also mentioned the profit and the financial reasons. And I think this is really key because obviously morals and ethics are really important, but a business leader might never consider this first order unless she's convinced that there is a business case. So I think that's the first reason, is that there's a prevalence of this fixed pie mentality, and my work is trying to show, no, there are win-wins. But I think the second reason is an interesting one, and one that you also prefaced in your question, Cali. Even if a business leader agrees with everything that I say, which is that if you invest in employees and customers and so on, you will improve profits, that only happens in the long term. Well, it does cost money to treat your employees well. Yes, in the long term, they will repay this with greater productivity and retention. But if we are evaluating our CEOs according to quarterly earnings, if we're paying them a pay package which highlights short-term profits, then even an enlightened leader who thinks, yes, there will be long-term benefits, well, I might not be around in the long term because I might be fired. So there's a short-term pressure, which means that you can't undertake the pie growing activity, even if you truly believe in it.
Okay, so this brings us, again, yes, and yes, and it's so fascinating to me because I don't know, I've been doing this work, creating flexible operating models for literally 2 decades. And for 2 decades in the organizations that were forward thinking enough to say, hey, we have to do this differently because the world is changing. And trust me, it has been for that long that there are organizations, not everybody and not many, but there have been, that are wise enough to see that they needed to be looking to the future and transforming the way work is done. Inevitably, they get so much more for the people that have the flexibility to think through what do they need to do, and how, when, and where can they do it best without outside of that sort of rigid traditional model that so many other organizations seem to be married to. And yet, and this is why your work has been so helpful to me, because it's so rigorous and it's so very, very grounded in data that's hard, very, very hard to dismiss. And yet, even then, it's like, you'd think everybody would be running to do this. And as we saw with the pandemic, most organizations were caught short. They were not flexible. They couldn't pivot as they needed to. And the ones that had done the work could pivot on a dime, and they didn't lose any momentum. They didn't lose any. So again, you can see that and you can know that, but it's just it hasn't moved the needle. So now here's my next question. Do you see signs that these players in that economic ecosystem, because it's everybody sort of playing their role together, right? The analysts don't understand it, so they don't incorporate it into their reports, which then feeds into what shareholders then invest in, and then that puts the pressure on the leaders. So again, it all sort of reinforces each other. Do you see signs that there's starting to be an understanding of your model, this pie growing model that is actually better for everybody, even shareholders? Do you see signs that that is happening? And if you do, why, and what are those signs? And if you don't, what do you think will get that shift to pie growing to happen?
Yes, I do see signs, Cali. So I am relatively optimistic, even though the world does face a lot of challenges. So I can't remember when we first connected with each other, Cali. It might be 10 or even more than 10
probably
years
when
ago.
I first came across your study, which we're going to talk about in a minute, this amazing study. And it's remarkable what you found. And it's so powerful what you found. So yeah, it was probably about a decade ago when I first found your study.
Yeah, so 10, 15 years ago, and why it probably was easy for us to find each other is we were quite sort of outsiders in the corporate world back then, is there were so few people who cared about things such as ethics and purpose and so on. And indeed, when I first presented that paper in a conference, the conference was an investors conference, and most of the investors who were there were not mainstream investors, not like the BlackRocks of the world, which are now trying to take this seriously. And that's probably why I was so happy that somebody like you was valuing my work, because most people back then I didn't really care. They thought, okay, responsibility, that sounds a bit fluffy. But what has changed since then is I think this has moved to a CEO level issue. So back then we had the idea of CSR, or corporate social responsibility. And I don't really like that term, because that has the connotation of being something that you can silo in a CSR department.
Exactly.
It's not
silo off,
business.
Peel it off into something over there. It sounds nice, but doesn't really have a meaning. Exactly.
You've got the business, and then you've got the CSR.
Got the CSR. Yeah.
But why we talk about business purpose is that that's something which is central to a chief executive. And also what I've really found is that investors are taking this seriously. And that's really important, because at the end of the day, it's the investors who vote on the board of directors. And even if you have an enlightened CEO, she doesn't have the freedom to pursue purpose unless investors are taking this seriously. And just to give one example, is for the last 6 years, I've served on the Responsible Investment Committee for Royal London Asset Management, which is a large UK investor. We run 6 sustainable funds, but who comes to our meeting? It's not just the head of sustainable investments or the head of responsible investment. Our chief investment officer comes, and he's responsible for everything.
Everything. Okay.
Not just the sustainable funds, but he realizes that even if you're running a standard fund, right, the only way that you can invest in companies that do well in the long term is if they take these issues seriously. So I do see this positive move. And one of the great things since the book came out is who has it resonated with? Actually, particularly the people who you might think might be the least open to purpose. So some are private equity firms, some are hedge funds, investment banks, law partnerships, and they're saying, no, we realized that the way that we were running business was actually not that great. In the past, it might have worked, but particularly now that we want to attract the millennial talent, they're really caring about purpose. Now we do realize that companies have responsibility to society, and those that have not discharged their responsibility are being walked away from. And so what is causing that shift? I do think you need the rigorous evidence there, because without it, it might seem wishful thinking, it might seem too good to be true. But if you have somebody like me, a hard-hearted finance professor who was an ex-investment banker, even I can say, well, there's a business case, and then, oh, actually, there is something behind it. It's not just ethics and morals, which are important, but there's also the business case behind it. Now, we're not fully there, so I'm not going to say that the world's completely changed, but what I do see is a real shift forwards. And I think you can see this in the C-suite within companies, and also in the investors. You do see this as not just being a niche SRI investment model, but something which is relevant for all funds.
So if I hear you correctly, this is giving me hope, which is great. When did that shift happen, do you think? About what year did you see your chief investment officer showing up at the meetings versus just the CSR people? About when did that happen? And what do you attribute that shift to?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to say there was a specific event. So there are certainly, with some movements, like events which are precipitating. Let's say Mr. Floyd's murder gave even lots of extra weight to the really important diversity movement. I think with just responsibility, it's just been the accumulation of efforts over time. So how did I end up on this responsible investment committee? I started 6 years ago. And this was in the House of Commons, that there was a bill on modern slavery. And I was invited to go to this debate, and I raised a point from the floor saying, okay, you think that if you are to impose this modern slavery regulation, it's going to be costly to business and business is going to oppose it. But I'm going to say, well, based on my research, it's actually in businesses' interest to treat their workers seriously, not just within the company, but their entire supply chain. And then based on that, actually, Royal London had an investor there who heard me say that and then invited me onto their committee. So I do think it is the greater business case when you are able to show them with evidence that this is something which is there in the data. So when we first probably discussed my study, it hadn't yet been published in an academic journal. And then you have to go through multiple rounds of revision to make sure that it's absolutely robust. And I was put through even more purgatory than most authors were, because back then people were even more skeptical about ESG type papers.
I can totally relate. I always say, if there was the amount of research showing the return and benefit of flexibility in the way people can work, everybody would have been doing it. It's just the amount of justification over and over and over. It's insane to me. And then to see what happened in the pandemic, that people were able to stay in business because people could work flexibly. Now it's like, oh, right. It's like those years where you had to keep going back and going back. I completely hear you. I'm sorry I interrupted you, but I can completely relate. So
no worries at all.
Keep going.
When I first came out with the paper, it still needed to go through all the revisions to be absolutely nailed on. And then once the paper finally got published in a journal, which was probably about 4 or 5 years after I started writing it, then that triggered other people to think, actually, maybe top journals are receptive to ESG work. Let's try to work on it. And then at some point, there probably was a tipping point that it became mainstream, but it's really hard to identify that. I think it's just sort of the cumulative weights of the effort of the people who started this journey a long time ago, like you and I, hopefully are now leading to this becoming mainstream, which is why lots of companies are now having these important conversations.
That is inspiring and encouraging. So what else needs to be done? What more could we do? So as you sit around the table with these more mainstream players in the economic ecosystem, and I'm fascinated by that ecosystem because, again, everybody sort of plays their role in it, right? To your point, the forward-thinking CEO can't really make a lot of change if they don't have board members who understand the rationale and business imperative behind all of this, but they're being pressured by the shareholders who are being supported and informed by the analysts, right? So what more can we be doing in terms of truly bringing this into this pie economics, pie growing mentality to bear even more broadly, do you think?
I think there's 2 important things that we can do. So the first is try to engender a long-term mindset. And how can we do that? I think it starts with CEO incentives, right? So a lot of people focus on CEO pay, but when they focus on it, they think about the level and the quantum of pay. And clearly that's not unimportant, right? We don't want outsized rewards, but I think what's really important is the horizon of pay. So if the CEO cares about the short-term profits, then she might not have the latitude to make investments. But if CEOs are given shares in their company, which they're required to hold for 5, 7, 10 years, then the horizon becomes quite different, and then they are willing to make the investments that are necessary to grow the pie. So a lot of my work is actually trying to lengthen these incentives. One of the nice things that happened in the UK recently is there was a change in the corporate governance code, changing the minimum horizon of incentives from 3 years to 5 years.
Oh,
now,
okay.
maybe even 5 years is not enough. Hopefully it will move to 7, but what you saw was a change in the right direction. And that's only the minimum. And there are many companies that are voluntarily going beyond that. So I think just the change in the long-term mindset is really important.
Is there a comparable governance? What's the comparable governance ruling in the US? Anything like that here, or is it just the Wild West here?
Yes, so there's no similar legislation or recommendation to my knowledge, but you do have investors which just might be pushing it for any effort anyway. So the Council of Institutional Investors has recently come out and they said, yes, we would like you to pay your executives more with long-term shares rather than these complicated short-term bonuses. And because they are quite an influential voice, hopefully that will be something which then encourages companies to be much more long-term in their approach. So there, I think it's more sort of voluntary action by investors rather than regulation. And if indeed the likes of BlackRock are truly behind the idea of responsibility, they're making a lot of public statements about it, but in order to truly put it into practice, they need to make sure that they engage with companies to lengthen the horizon of pay. And they have the ability to do that because they have say on pay votes within the companies in the US.
Okay, so go ahead.
Sorry, Gally. So that was one thing you said.
Oh, I want to get to the second. Yes, go.
Yeah, sorry. The second thing
keep going.
Is actually a little bit tempering what I previously said. So I said this was great that loads of people are now taking responsibility seriously. It has become mainstream. But I think sometimes people now get too far to the other extreme. They get overly excited about responsibility. They think, oh, let's just do it and let's try to measure it as much as possible. And now what you have is this huge plethora of metrics asking people to report on this and that and the other dimension. And obviously, as a finance professor, I do believe in the power of data. But the problem with data is that there's many important dimensions of responsibility which are qualitative. Right, so if you want to treat your work as well, clearly you care about their pay and turnover, you can measure that. But things like corporate culture, right, the things that I know that you have devoted your career to working on, culture and flexibility and meaningful work and skills development, can you really measure that? If indeed we are forcing companies to disclose only these quantitative measures, it can lead to some box ticking approach by companies to tick the particular boxes at the expense of dimensions such as flexibility. So as my boss at Royal London says, you can't make the artisan computational. Right? How do you assess whether a company is truly responsible? Yes, you will use some metrics, right? But you will also want to look at some of these other dimensions, just like how do you choose what job to go for? Yes, you're going to look at quantitative things like the pay and the benefits, but other things such as do you believe in the purpose of the company? How well do you get along with the people? Those are important things. And I think in the rush to sort of jump on this ESG bandwagon, we need to recognize that it's not always going to be a simple data approach of trying to measure it. We need to use different tools to the measurement that we used to use when we focused only on profits. So people are trying to use the outdated models, measurement, which did work for profits, when they think, oh, let's suddenly move to this new thing of assessing ESG, not realizing that actually we might need a different way of assessing it. So I would say more haste, less speed, and just like the tortoise and the hare.
Interesting. And again, this goes back to that ecosystem, right? Like those models, those outdated models are so much what they've all relied on. And so they're going to have to be open to rethinking about how they create the value that they're bringing to the table in terms of how they're doing their analysis and how shareholders or what they are looking for in an organization and from their leaders. It's a different model of leadership that you're looking for in the decision makers in organizations if you do look beyond those quantifiable metrics, correct? It's fascinating how it all has to shift.
Absolutely, and I think what is great is people are recognizing the need to prioritize ESG issues. However, if they think, okay, well, let's immediately try and jump on this as soon as we can and use the old ways of analyzing ESG, which does involve data and measurement, and realizing that that needs to be modified quite significantly, then actually you're going to have more a box ticking approach. And so maybe one analogy to this is the No Child Left Behind Act in the US, which was on education. And so that had similar mentality to ESG initiatives. It's something where we need to start measuring it. It's nebulous. Let's try to have accountability. And so they had standardized tests. And so what did this lead to? It led to people starting to tick boxes and teaching to the test, only focusing on the dimensions being measured. And I do think we might get this issue with ESG if there is this push towards measuring everything. Indeed, with investors saying, well, let's allocate capital based on these metrics, just like education departments said, let's fund schools based on the test scores.
Yes.
Then you will just get this overly focused approach to these metrics.
That is a great analogy, and actually a great pivot to the next thing I want to talk about, because this is what your research is all about, really. And this wonderful study that you did that I originally connected with almost a decade ago, your Best Companies to Work For research, and really the role of employee satisfaction, which can be hard to measure, in superior returns. So, I want to give everybody a little bit of background about this research. So in December, and I think it was December 2012, I believe that's when I saw it first came out. I think you published, that's when I think it was published, so check me on the date. Research that found that the 100 best companies to work for in America, now this is important, delivered total shareholder returns and beat their peers by 2.3 to 3.8% per year from 1984 to 2011. That's correct, right? That's the way to sort of summarize what you found. Is that the accurate description?
Absolutely, yeah, that's entirely accurate. Yeah.
So that's huge, just huge. You wrote about the study recently in an article in Medium explaining that the Best Companies list measures employee satisfaction on 5 dimensions: credibility and fairness, which could be seen as like compensation and diversity; respect, which is opportunities and benefits; pride and camaraderie, which is around teamwork, philanthropy, and celebration, is a way to describe it. And therefore, what you found is employee satisfaction is a critical differentiator. And what I think is even more powerful and interesting is that your study was recently independently replicated by other researchers. And this is where it gets interesting, and I want to hear what you think about this. They replicated your study, which is really important because a lot of studies are very hard to replicate, especially 10 years later. So this other team of researchers replicated Alex's research and found that it held over the past 10 years, which, if I have this correct, I'm going to read what the researchers wrote, and then I want to hear what you think. They wrote, Edmans showed a portfolio of companies with the highest levels of employee satisfaction earned significant and positive abnormal returns. However, 10 years later, employee satisfaction should be priced in by now. So those results should not hold out in the sample, but it does. Because, and we're going to get back to what you said earlier, intangibles like employee satisfaction are inherently difficult to incorporate into stock prices. So here we are, it's a decade later. And again, still the players in that economic ecosystem that we talked about haven't caught on and thus priced in and rewarded high levels of employee satisfaction, or that pie growing that you have so eloquently outlined as being powerful. It's not reflected in the stock prices. So I just think it's important for everybody to understand why your research has had such an important impact for me. Because as we've helped organizations execute flexible operating models, it is clear that flexibility and the ability to fit your work and life together are drivers of employee satisfaction. They have been, we've correlated it, it's there. And pre-pandemic, and I'm going to say even now, post-COVID, employers still are not understanding that this has to be a fundamental way their organizations do their work. And even more so now that employees actually expect a level of control and flexibility over how, when, and where they work in order to be satisfied working for you. So I guess my question to you is, what is it going to take for those intangibles like employee satisfaction to be incorporated into that strategic decision-making in a meaningful way? Because there is an understanding you put it in your research, it has been replicated. The pie growing mentality, the pie growing approach that incorporates employee satisfaction does increase long-term profits. And again, how do we get that employee satisfaction, that intangibles, how do we build them into the execution model and the decision-making?
Lots of richness in your question, Cali. So I think I'll first start with my original paper and then what happened in the 10 years since.
Great.
So you're right, the paper was published in 2012, but I had to start the research in 2007. It took 5 years to perfect the study. So why did I even look at this to begin with? Right, I wanted to look at if companies are treating their workers better. Are they just fluffy companies that are not being efficient at controlling their costs? Because Henry Ford would say, well, if your employees are happy, then you're not working them hard enough. And I showed that actually this was the opposite. So consistent with what you're seeing, what you're doing as a practitioner, Cali, is actually if you're treating your workers well, it does grow the pie rather than simply splitting the pie differently. And so when the paper came out in 2012, you would hope that then people would start acting on this and saying, if indeed companies that treat their workers well beat their peers by 2.3 to 3.8% per year, then I, as an investor, I should start investing in these companies. And then if everybody starts investing it, then the return should go away because it should be priced in. And you might think, well, that should particularly be the case since over the last 10 years, ESG has been so popular. Exactly. If there's ever any time that people should be paying attention to employee satisfaction, it should be the last decade. Right. So why has this not happened? And why did the replication find that my study's results still held? And I think it's going to be linked to my answer to your last question, Cali, is that yes, there has been a lot of focus on ESG, but based on quantitative metrics. So yes, people want to care about employee well-being, but they might look at things such as worker turnover, CEO to worker pay ratios, injury statistics, maybe pure demographic measures of diversity. And all of those things are really, really important, but they're not the full picture. Clearly, diversity is something that you and I both care about a lot, but that's not just demographic diversity. Are you developing a corporate culture that is going to encourage dissent? Are you creating a psychologically safe workplace so that people are willing to express their views? And those are the things that you can't quantify. Those are the things that you can only evaluate through some boots on the ground approaches. So what I have started to do recently is to work with some asset managers. They actually approached me and they said, look, we are really interested in your work and we realize that this is something that you can't measure with a few statistics. Can you help us develop a framework? So that's, let's say, a set of questions that are probing and discerning that we can use to ask management.
So these are investors. I think this is really important, Alex, because this work is there's a struggle to do this inside of organizations, right? But it matters. Actually, it matters that investors are now trying to figure out how to measure, which then as boards understand that these questions are being asked on the investor level, which then will influence what shareholders then decide, then boards need to understand that those same questions are being asked within their organizations and measured. So I just want to, am I correct on that? That's how I see it all reinforcing itself. Honestly, is that true?
That's a great way of putting things, Cali. So that virtuous circle, because if investors are going to be evaluating boards according to sort of blunt metrics, such as, let's say, turnover or pay ratios, then the board just can tick that box, right? One way that you can reduce employee turnover is actually keep workers in the organization, but in non-meaningful work. So let me give an example. So in Japan, you have some companies like Toshiba and Panasonic where employees used to make magnetic tape. You don't need that anymore in a digital world. But what they've done is they've just kept those employees within the company. They work in what's known as banishment rooms. So they just review security footage all day. Okay. So that doesn't provide them with meaningful work or human dignity, but it ticks the boxes in terms of turnover statistics. They're saying, okay, we don't get rid of people, but actually it might be better for them to allow those people to be let go and work without placement in order to try and find them into another job. But if all you're looking at as an investor is these blunt metrics, then people will teach to the test, they will hit those metrics. But if instead boards think, oh, our investors are going to be asking me about, can you give examples of innovations that you've done which were prompted by suggestions from your employees? Can you tell me about the process that you undergo to ensure that employees are able to come up with their own views? Are there processes that you do to make sure that actually failures are rewarded? So if somebody comes up with a great idea which ultimately fails, what happens to that person? Can you tell me what you do to try to allow people to have the freedom to try, but even if it ultimately fails? And if indeed investors are going to be probing on that, then the board needs to make sure that the management is accountable for that. And so what is really great, and you're right to highlight this, Cali, is that now there are some long-term investors who are really thinking, if we're going to be differentiated from our competitors, one thing that we want to do is to evaluate corporate culture. That's going to be the key driver of the performance of companies. And what this replication study found is that even in 2021, it's not prices of the market. So if we can evaluate the companies that truly have a great corporate culture, then this is going to be one where we are going to be delivering long-term superior returns.
That's great. So what are some of the questions? Can you share that? Some of the questions that you're, even if you haven't 100% landed on them, what are some of the questions you're finding are important to add into that intangible measurement structure?
Yeah, so unfortunately I can't share the specific questions because that's proprietary, but what I can talk about is the general approach. So the general approach does recognize that actually the optimal culture within a company is dependent on the specific context. And I think that's really important because what some investors might have is their metrics for culture, and they'll apply them across all organizations. And particularly if you're a diversified investor, then you need something which is one size fits all and you can apply to your entire portfolio. But the world is not one size fits all. And let's just give another practical example. So many people think that a great culture is one which values a lot of safety, where you give your employees security that they will have jobs for life and so on. And that does work in many organizations. However, you look at Netflix's website, what's really interesting there is they say, well, we have a really high sort of performance-driven culture. We will always only keep the best people, but not everybody will end up being a great fit for us. But because they're so about innovation, they want to make sure that they have people who are truly at the top of the game in terms of being able to deliver this fantastic product to the customer base. So they are upfront that their culture is going to be more performance-oriented and more driven than other places. That's not for everybody. Right, which is fine, right? Different employees look for different things, but that's something that works well for their organization. Another thing is delegation, right? Normally delegation and freedom really does work, but there are other organizations where sort of the margin for safety, where these are things might be mining or oil drilling or so on, where you do want to have a rules culture. The military is one where you have that, so hierarchy can be good in certain circumstances. And so what the framework is trying to look at is, are there general principles that apply in every organization? Right? But are there also certain principles that might apply in a couple of organizations depending on the culture? And let's try to discern, is the CEO aware of what's best for her organization, rather than just having read a Harvard Business Review article and just apply that to her company, even if the context is inappropriate. So that's sort of the broad thrust of the framework that I'm able to share.
And that actually aligns with a flexible work culture. Is that one size does not fit all. And, you know, we're now having this debate back in the office, full-time remote. It's like, no, it's about what that organization does, not only just enterprise level, but deeper in the organization, and then allowing how, when, and where that work happens to adapt to that business reality based upon what that particular part of the organization and what those employees are having to achieve. And that's a consistent process that you can follow, but the outcome is going to look different because one size does not fit all. And it's recognizing that it's not going to be a cookie cutter approach, that you have to adapt it. So I think it's interesting how what you're saying aligns with ultimately how organizations have to move forward, rethinking essentially their operating model in terms of across workplaces, spaces, even time, and just adapting their policies and processes. It's all going to be dependent on the context. So
absolutely. And any evaluation method that investors use needs to recognize the importance of context specificity. And my fear is that metrics, right, they are informative, but unless you interpret the metrics within a particular context, then there's something which is only a very small part of the picture.
This is encouraging also Because if this is the message that's coming from the analyst community by way through to shareholders, through to boards, hopefully they will begin to see that they do have to take this more context-driven approach. And on top of that, it is related to things like employee satisfaction most broadly on all those different dimensions. And we will hopefully see more senior level leader adaptation of the way they lead to achieve those goals. And that brings me to my final question to you before I want to hear what you're working on and what we can help share with everybody. What do senior leaders need to do differently? How do they have to lead differently? Because what I'm seeing right now as organizations really are grappling with what is a fundamentally new way of working as an organization, I see a lot of leaders holding on to the traditional model that really does not apply anymore. And they're losing people because employees know they can work differently. They've just been doing it. And so there's this tension in the system that I'm seeing leaders struggling with knowing how they need to lead. And what do you think is, as we move into this more employee satisfaction, pie growing, ESG driven way of evaluating organizations, what is it going to mean for senior leaders and how they have to lead?
I think it'll mean two things. So the first is just to recognize the criticality of purpose. So I think many CEOs now get it, which was one of my prior answers, but still some view this as being a nice to have extra. So yes, in good times when the company's flush with cash, we can start thinking about purpose, but maybe in a pandemic, we need to focus on profit. But what I want to stress is actually a focus on purpose also means a focus on profit in many cases. So this should be something central. And the second thing I think leaders need to change is to just have the confidence to do things for intrinsic rather than instrumental reasons. So often as a leader, you think, let me stick to the frameworks that perhaps finance professors like me have been teaching for the last 50 years, which is when you make an investment decision, you try to forecast the benefits from that investment. And if the benefits are greater than the cost, then we're going to do it. But what that means is that for then any investment where you can't justify it with a financial calculation, then a CEO often doesn't have the confidence to do that. And I think you can apply this to even individual people. You don't need to be the CEO, right? Why do I choose to do this interview with you? I just love doing this interview. I love having this conversation. Would it be that I was to think, well, if I spent my 1 hour instead, I could do some consulting, I could earn this amount. Well, let me compare this. Well, if I was to chat to Cali, okay, maybe some people might sort of hear of my work and sort of buy my book and so on, but that would never, the small royalties I get, that would never justify, right, how much I could have got with consulting, but that's sort of not my objective. And it could be that ultimately, that unexpectedly, that I get some business like later down the line, but that's never entering my conversation, my calculation. I'm going to have the confidence to do things for intrinsic, not instrumental reasons. But what my research suggests is that even if you have that intrinsic approach, later on it can become profitable to you in unexpected ways. So I think to give leaders the confidence to make decisions which might seem crazy, right, on a financial level. Let's think about Patagonia, right? On Black Friday, it took out an advert saying, don't buy our jacket. Right, we're going to introduce this new program to allow you to repair your clothes rather than buying new clothes because that's good for the environment. Crazy decision for business reasons, but in the long run, I think it has paid off and improved their business because now people see this as a company which is fully committed to the planet. And so a lot of customers are willing to buy their products. And so I think to have that confidence, to have this purpose-driven approach is something that I would encourage leaders to try to implement.
Very interesting, Alex. And I have to tell you, I am so glad that we have had this conversation, and it has meant so much to me to be able to talk to you one-on-one and hear you just explain more deeply what it is that you have been trying to do and are now doing, and seeing real meaningful movement in this area. And it makes me very hopeful. And I think we will all benefit as a result. So thank you so very much. Is there anything else you'd like to share or add? Obviously, buy your book. It is fantastic. To your point, I think there are a lot of people jumping on the ESG bandwagon right now. And get Alex's book if you really want to understand how to do this right and what this means. it really does give you a roadmap in terms of how to execute it within your own organization and to think it through even just as an individual. I highly, highly recommend it. Anything else?
Sure. Well, most of my answers have been two parts, so let me end with a two-part answer. So there's two things that I'm working on right at the moment. The first is to make this even more mainstream. So what is great, yes, I really appreciate your kind comments on the book, but you have to be somebody who wants to choose to buy a book about ESG. So what I'm now doing is I'm changing the core finance textbook. So for 40 years, the main finance textbook is called Principles of Corporate Finance. That's what I was taught at Oxford. It's what we taught at MIT. I was given it at Morgan Stanley. And I've now become a co-author of that book for the 14th edition. So from chapter 1, I have put in the importance of responsible business. So hopefully the next generation of business school students going and doing MBAs will read in chapter 1 the importance of caring about wider society. And so I think that's really important.
Okay, can I just stop you for 1 second? As a Columbia Business School grad who worked off that book, I'm going to tell people don't understand. That is huge. That is huge, because this then is the mentality that you send all of these future business leaders out into the world with. They become the analysts, they become the hedge fund people, they become the senior leaders. And this is their bread and butter way of approaching how they look at the finances of their organization. So Alex, this is huge, and I'm very happy to hear this news. So I'm sorry, go on to your second point.
Thanks so much. You probably heard it. We probably studied it when it was Brealey and Myers or Brealey Myers Allen. It's now going to be Brealey Myers Allen and Edmans from hopefully April next year. So that it's a pleasure to be invited.
I may even go buy a copy. Just it's different, cool. Right?
Thank you. And then number 2 is I'm working on trying to improve financial literacy. So I think financial literacy is one of the most important skills, particularly for people to know how to save and how to invest and so on. We talk about income inequality, and that's obviously important, but wealth inequality is not just based on income inequality, but how can you invest and save the money? And the issue is that, you do get those courses at Columbia and at Wharton and London Business School, but it costs so much to do these courses. Ironically, the people most in need of that are the people who are least able to afford it. So I have another position in an institution called Gresham College in the UK, which is weird. You can't do a degree at this college. All it does is it gives free lectures to the public, just like Michael Faraday used to give on science. And I'm really happy to be the Gresham Professor of Business. So my current lecture series is called The Principles of Finance. It goes through basics like compound interest, saving, investing, what is a mutual fund, what happens when you buy and sell shares. So this is accessible to a very wide audience. So I know that there's many people who are finance professionals. Say my 14-year-old son or daughter is watching this and it's understandable. There's retirees watching that. So for anybody who wants a resource of financial literacy made accessible and simple, hopefully that will be a resource to people.
And that's something I will get the link to that course. It's public, right? You can just
it's completely free. So
great.
You can watch the video. There's an audio podcast. There's the Cliff's Notes version. So whichever medium you want. My passion is to make these things accessible to all, and I'm really grateful to Gresham for giving me that platform.
Oh, that's great. So we will put a link in the notes, the transcript of this fantastic conversation that I really appreciate. And actually, I do encourage people to go to Medium and read Alex's article he wrote about the business case for diversity, which is really fascinating, because what I thought is so important is you then make the case for why it should be diversity and inclusion. And that goes back to many of the findings from that original research around employee satisfaction, that inclusion is the key, because it allows people to bring to the table all of their different ways of thinking, all the things that diversity will allow them to offer to the broader day-to-day execution of the work in the organization is really what it's all about. Did I say that correctly? Because I thought that was really important what you were saying. So again, please check that article out, because again, we're all talking about diversity, but really there is this element of inclusion that truly is going to be the differentiator most likely. So Alex, again, thank you. This has been a thrill for me, truly. And I look forward to continuing to follow your work. And again, I thank you for how you have supported mine truly over all these years.
Really enjoyed it, Kelly. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you.